In 1911, a writer by the name of Holbrook Jackson published a small book of aphorisms entitled Platitudes in the Making, Precepts and Advices for Gentlefolk. He gave a copy to G.K. Chesterton, an author and journalist known throughout England at that time by his initials alone. Chesterton annotated his copy of Jackson's book with a green pencil, and that annotated copy made its way into the hands of a doctor who purchased it in a San Francisco bookshop in 1955. Dr. Kessler and Ignatius Press published a facsimile edition of Chesterton's annotated copy in 1997. Page 13 of Jackson's book contained this platitude in the making: truth is one's own conception of things. Chesterton rebutted in green pencil, the big blunder. All thought is an attempt to discover if one's own conception is true or not. The book arrived 5 years too late for its big blunder to be avoided by the United States Supreme Court. In 1992, that court, in its majority opinion, authored by Republican-appointed Justice Anthony Kennedy, made the big blunder its justification for its Casey versus Planned Parenthood decision, about which the Washington Examiner in 2018 had this to say: not all Supreme Court cases are equal. There are decisions that are such a great offense to the text of the Constitution and the spirit of the Declaration of Independence that they ought to overwhelm a justice's legacy. For Kennedy, that decision was Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the 1992 opinion upholding Roe versus Wade. Sean Davis, a co-founder of Federalist, threw some light on just how the big blunder blunders when he retweeted this tweet by Steve Deese. When you get to define what voter fraud is, you can't commit it. When you get to define what a baby is, you can't kill it. When you get to define what the news is, you can't fake it. And then you get tenured to indoctrinate a generation. Deese saw a point and tweeted it. Then Davis saw it. Then I saw it through Davis. And now you through me. What allowed us all to see what Deese saw, to see his point? Something called reason. And what is reason? It is the faculty which makes the human being human. Man is a rational animal. Man's distinguishing mark of all creatures is his ability to reason. And the infallible sign that he is not using the reason he innately possesses is his committing of intellectual blunders. There is phenomena all around man which he has to make sense of. The framework which allows him to make sense of it all is reason. And reason is the heart of what is known as the moral law. The moral law, therefore, has to be the heart of the civil law, because the civil law is there to protect man, and the mark of man's humanity is precisely his ability to reason. Back to Deese's tweet. Let's listen again to it. When you get to define what voter fraud is, you can't commit it. When you get to define what a baby is, you can't kill it. When you get to define what the news is, you can't fake it. And then you get tenured to indoctrinate a generation. What is Deese's complaint here? What is the blunder his observations uncover? Is it not that someone is going around impermissibly defining things? That raises the question of why it is impermissible to get to define what is, for example, voter fraud, a baby, the news, and we could continue. What marriage is, what anti-Semitism is. Why is it impermissible for anyone to get to define any of these things? The answer is implicit in seeing Deese's point. It is impermissible because truth gets to decide these things, not any one man or any group of men. And that raises another question. Who is to say what truth is? The answer is anyone who looks. And when man looks, what is he using? Reason. There is an implication behind Deese's tweet, and the implication is true. Anyone who is going around getting to define these things is making himself the arbiter of reason. But no mere man gave man reason. Reason came with man and is his distinguishing mark. So some man is going around playing God and substituting his will to conform the truth of what voter fraud is, of what a baby is, of what news is, to his desires, and imposing this will of his on the country. Deese adverts to this imposition in the words, "And then you get tenured to indoctrinate a generation." Do we know who that is? Who that man is, that group is, going around impermissibly defining things in place of reason? Who, for example, got to define what marriage is? As Joe Biden and Amy Dean told us, thank the Jews. Sumner Redstone, born Murray Rothstein, latterly head of CBS, Paramount Pictures, Simon & Schuster, MTV, Comedy Central, and Nickelodeon, or Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, and all the Jewish heads of the handful of media corporations, social or MSM, on what news is. And what did the New York Times remind the world via tweet the day of the election? The role of declaring the winner of a presidential election in the U.S. falls to the news media. The broadcast networks and cable news outlets have vowed to be prudent. Here's how it will work. A tweet the New York Times then swiftly deleted, but not before one Jerry Dunleavy commented on it. "I can't believe they tweeted this, LOL." Jerry Dunleavy saw the chutzpah. What did he see it with? Reason. So that means that there is another framework out there, not the moral law, used by these Jews occupying leadership positions in society to interpret the phenomena all around us. It is a framework which replaces the reason-based moral law framework. And it is this framework which is informing, alarmingly, increasingly, and invisibly, the civil law. What is that competing and contradictory framework? What is its name? Relativism. Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI saw that. In 2005, he warned of the dictatorship of relativism confronting the world. At a mass prior to the conclave to elect a new pope after John Paul II's death, The then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger said, "In these hours, above all, we ask God with insistence, so that after the great gift of Pope John Paul II, he will again give us a pastor according to his heart, a pastor who will lead us to knowledge of Christ, to his love, and to true joy." In his homily, Cardinal Ratzinger referred to the maturity of the faith of Catholics and said that they cannot remain immature in the faith, in a state of inferiority, as they run the risk of being tossed about and carried here and there by any doctrinal wind. How many doctrinal winds we have known in these last decades, how many ideological currents, how many styles of thought, he lamented. The thought of many Christians has often been tossed about by these waves, tossed from one end to the other, from Marxism to liberalism to libertinism, from collectivism to radical individualism, from atheism to religious mysticism, from agnosticism to syncretism, the prelate observed. Cardinal Ratzinger added that, meanwhile, to have a clear faith, according to the creed of the Church, is labeled fundamentalism. And this, while relativism, that is, allowing oneself to be led here and there by any wind of doctrine, is seen as the only behavior abreast of the times. We are now witnessing the dictatorship of relativism, which does not recognize anything as absolute and leaves as the ultimate measure only the measure of each one and his desires, Cardinal Ratzinger added. Christians, however, have another measure, which is the Son of God, true man. Mature faith, he said, does not follow fashions and the latest novelty, but is profoundly rooted in friendship with Christ. In his homily, which was received with prolonged applause, Cardinal Ratzinger also said that priests are here to serve and must give fruit that endures. In this connection, the Cardinal cautioned people who wish to leave their mark in life. He said that money and buildings and books do not last, as after a certain time, everything disappears. What remains eternally, he added, is the human soul. What is key here for our purposes is that the framework of relativism informing the civil law now claims to secure man's liberty by enthroning every man's desire. But this can only be done by discounting every man's ability to reason. Reason will no longer be the definer of what a thing like voter fraud, or a baby, or the news is. What every man can know counts for nothing under the relativistic framework. What counts alone is one's own desires, one's own conception of things, including the desire to get to define in law one's own conception of things. This is the Jewish leadership's desire, and it is they who are getting to define, against reason, what the civil law will recognize as a valid election, what is baby killing, what is news, and so on. As Frederick Copleston said to Bertrand Russell in their 1946 BBC-aired debate on the existence of God, if God doesn't exist, then it follows logically that each man need follow no law higher than his own will. And this will mean, in practice, that is, in law, that each man will be free to follow what the richest and most powerful man's will in any matter is. Copleston in that debate had proven, using reason alone, the existence of God. Russell was instead interested in conforming the truth of things to his own desires, his own conception of things. But what his promoting desire in place of reason would mean for the man in the street, Russell could recognize as a dictatorship, but he did not care about it. We live now under this dictatorship, which calls itself liberty, because when you get to define what liberty is, you can't be a dictator. As Justice Kennedy put it in the Casey decision upholding Roe's ruling, which effectively declared open season on unborn babies, at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. And he ended the paragraph with, "Belief about these matters could not define the attributes of personhood were they formed under the compulsion of the state." Justice Kennedy is here informing us that if the court applied reason's framework to the Roe v. Wade decision, then the relativist framework would no longer have any force in law to get to define anything. He writes this as though that were a problem and not a good thing. Since his fretting makes no obvious sense, it raises the question, for whom exactly would this create a problem? That question is answered by Clifford Goldstein in a 1997 Liberty Magazine essay in which he defends Kennedy's passage. Goldstein writes, "Whatever his motives, Kennedy's notorious mystery passage is neither notorious nor a mystery. It is instead a politically correct expression of the best principles of a people who considered rights of conscience so fundamental to how they wanted to live that they framed a constitution to protect those rights. The mystery instead is why those who profess to believe in those same rights should find the passage so notorious." Goldstein is insisting that political correctness, which is just another name for relativism, and not reason, is the framework through which the Constitution must be read. But, all importantly, who are the people he refers to as framing a constitution in this politically correct way because they considered such a framework so fundamental to how they want to live? The people known as the American people? Or the people, of whom Mr. Goldstein is one, known as the group the Jews? This is a pressing question. It is increasingly being treated as an anti-Semitic one, but it will be treated by the civil law as an instance of anti-Semitism if Clifford Goldstein and company continue to get away with irrationally interpreting the civil law with the relativist framework in place of reason's framework. Using the relativist framework will mean that those rich and powerful enough will get to define what anti-Semitism is. Reason, discoverable by all human beings, will not be allowed to govern us. And when you get to define what anti-Semitism is, you can't make a false charge. Mike Pompeo, the current State Department head, recently released a video announcing,
"Everywhere. The State Department. The State Department is forging new alliances in the fight against anti-Semitism with social media giants, faith groups, activists, NGOs, and other governments, and, indeed, all of you. We have concrete recommendations, like for social media platforms to adopt and enforce the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism in its entirety in their terms of service. As a former Army officer, I believe that defining the threat is the first step in confronting it. President Trump understands this too. He issued an executive order last December that employs this definition for the entire federal government. We're here to discuss that step and the steps to come. I'll close with a note.
When the Jews get to define what anti-Semitism is, it gets defined as a certain perception of Jews. We are back to Holbrook Jackson's platitude, truth is one's own conception of things. And if that is so, how can any certain perception of Jews be wrong, if all is just perception and there is no universal objective truth? This self-refuting, irrational premise tips us off that intellectual fraud is being committed. One group's own conception of things is going to inform the law, not everybody's conception. To paraphrase a Simpsons episode of old, in one way, we're all winners, but in another and more accurate way, the Jews are the winners. And that group's conception of things is not based on reason, but on what is useful to maintaining its hegemony. And what is needed to maintain that unjust hegemony is bringing the law's coercive power to bear on suppressing criticism of Jews misusing their power. The media will tell you for months on end that the Centers of Disease Control and Anthony Fauci want you to wear a mask and that you should trust them as leaders who follow the science, irrespective of the easily reportable truth that these leaders only appeal vainly to science to mask their truthless analysis of the scientific facts of the COVID case. But the media do not shout from the rooftops to you that Mike Pompeo and the State Department redefined, away from reason, anti-Semitism, just as they do not tell you that the World Health Organization redefined pandemic before launching its COVID narrative. No, the role of watchdog is left now to anyone who cares enough to look. Like this tweeter who discovered Pompeo's State Department announcement about the new definition of anti-Semitism. Quote, "While you were sleeping, they took away your free speech right to criticize Israel, Jews, or question the Holocaust." The relativist framework, which also goes by the name of political correctness, or more recently, woke, was known in communist Russia, whose leadership was also overwhelmingly Jewish, as official opposition to what it got to define as anti-Soviet activity. Theodore Dalrymple, the pen name of Anthony Daniels, whose lineage is Russian and German Jewish, and whose ideology is conservatism, employs reason's framework, not relativism's, to the phenomenon known as political correctness, and detects it to be, as opposed to defines it to be, quote, communist propaganda writ small. In my study of communist societies, I came to the conclusion that the purpose of communist propaganda was not to persuade or convince, not to inform, but to humiliate, and therefore the less it corresponded to reality, the better. When people are forced to remain silent when they are being told the most obvious lies, or even worse, when they are forced to repeat the lies themselves, they lose once and for all their sense of probity. To assent to obvious lies is in some small way to become evil oneself. One standing to resist anything is thus eroded and even destroyed. A society of emasculated liars is easy to control. I think if you examine political correctness, it has the same effect and is intended to. All thought is an attempt to discover whether one's conceptions are true or not, Chesterton reminds us. Theodore Dalrymple thinks that human beings can and should examine political correctness. Examine with what? With reason. And what does reason disclose? That political correctness serves to make our citizenry into emasculated liars, easy to control. Who, therefore, benefits from the relativist framework interpreting the Constitution of the United States? Is it the people who benefit from being made over into emasculated liars? Or is it the ones whose rule necessitates impermissibly controlling them? Continuing to apply the relativist, politically correct framework to interpreting the Constitution of the United States, as Clifford Goldstein urged and falsely implied was the American way, can only result in the continued transformation of the American people into emasculated liars. We appear to be already halfway there. Human rights flow from being human, and reason is the distinguishing mark of the human being. The state's inability to coerce virtue in the private citizen does not imply a corresponding obligation on its part to tolerate public vice spread by any citizen. Just because the state can't force you to proclaim to the world your understanding that human life is sacred and deserving of state protection from conception to natural death, doesn't mean the state must allow for the public practice of abortion. The state's duty is to protect its people, born and unborn, from harm, and to secure the common good. The common good to all the people is secured by reason informing the civil law of the state. The moral law, based as it is upon reason, is the correct, not politically correct, framework to interpret the civil law. Goldstein's appeal to conscience rights to uphold killing unborn children is irrational. His intellectual premise is that one has no liberty if he is not free to use the relativism framework to interpret the Constitution. To repeat, this framework's premise is the big blunder. Truth is one's own conception of things. The premise's blundering irrationality is seen in its contradicting itself, namely, the objective truth is that there is no objective truth. Goldstein is merely resurrecting the intellectual error in order to inform the civil law identified by G.K. Chesterton long since. The big blunder of conflating a man's grasp of reason with his grasp as reason itself. If that were reasonable, there would be no such thing as a disagreement, or a need to convince anyone of anything, let alone a purpose to communication. The big blunder is simply intellectual fraud. The relativistic framework is outed as an irrational framework which serves to supplant authentically human, reason-based judgment of phenomena, common to and discoverable by all, with a putative neutrality which turns out, upon examination, to be one group's imposition of its collective will on the country. When you, not reason, get to define what is reason, you can't be unreasonable. The U.S. Supreme Court has before it an historic opportunity to expose not only voter fraud, but to reverse the intellectual fraud of relativism by which the Constitution has been hijacked to erect a de facto dictatorship. By returning the Constitution to its moral law interpretive framework, it returns the American people to genuinely representative, reason-based self-government. Or the court can continue the intellectual fraud as expressed by Justice Kennedy's mystery clause, by which it imposed upon the country the will of the most powerful and rich among us, and turned democracy into a dictatorship whose relativism makes of the governed emasculated liars. The choice is as stark as it is clear. We can live under a dictatorship based upon irrationality, born of anti-Catholic bigotry, known variously as relativism or political correctness or woke. The major Jewish organizations, like the Anti-Defamation League with respect to hate speech, who get to do defining, and via their defining are de facto forcing conversion, do so by demanding that the governed, under pain of law, convert publicly to their own arbitrary, irrational way of thinking and acting. Or we can live under reason, discernible to all, and truly be the land of the free and the home of the brave. Relativism, that is, truth conformed to desire, leads to dictatorship and self-defeat. The moral law, that is, desire conformed to truth, conformed to reason, leads to self-governance through self-mastery.